All right, well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Brad Gentry. I'm an Associate Dean here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this, our first event in the Diverse Voices for Environmental Leadership series this year. I don't know how many of you were able to join in last year's program, but we had a course led by Dean Peter Crane and Francis Beinecke in the fall, and then a number of speakers in the spring, and just an amazing array of folks. We're very excited to be able to continue that effort this year, not only at F&ES, but in collaboration with the Provost's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Peabody Museum's Evolutions, or EVO, after-school program. The goal of the series is to engage with a broader range of individuals and communities in the efforts to address climate change and achieve a more sustainable and just economy in the 21st century. It offers an opportunity for all of us to reflect on ways to work with a diverse set of interests on these challenges, as well as how the U.S. environmental movement can better engage all parts of American society. Last year, we brought in a wonderful array of speakers, including Reverend Lennox Yearwood from the Hip Hop Caucus, Adriana Quintero from Voces Verde, and Manny Diaz, the former mayor of Miami. We have a wonderful lineup again this year, 5 events this fall, and we're really excited that each of these events will start with a pre-lecture designed specifically for New Haven public high school students who are members of the Peabody's EVO program, led by Andrea Moto here, in collaboration with Yale's Pathways to Science program. So welcome, EVO students. We're very glad you're here. Today's first session has been organized by Michael Mendez, the James and Mary Pinchot Faculty Fellow here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and as you will see, we'll focus on California's cap-and-trade laws, forests, and indigenous rights. Before I turn it over to Michael, let me just say a few words about him. And I love that his bio describes himself as an engaged scholar. We need lots of those. He uses the fields of urban planning, public health, science and technology studies to help us understand how the built environment, policymaking process, and social movements influence sustainability and health in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. His academic work is strongly influenced by more than a decade of experience in the public and private sectors, including with the California State Legislature, Sacramento's Planning Commission, and the Office of the President of the University of California. And I gather congratulations are in order in your new appointment by the governor to the State Mining and Geology Board. So excited to see where that leads you, and over to you for the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for everyone and audience members for joining us here today on this first lecture series of Diverse Voices. I'm very honored to help kick off this lecture series on how do we talk about diversity in the environmental field. So when I was first approached about kicking off the Diverse Lecture series, I really wanted to take a very different approach and really trying to understand what does diversity means in practice. What does it mean out there in the real world, particularly in the environmental policymaking world? How do we negotiate these concepts of diversity in the context of policymaking and environmental governance? So this panel on cap-and-trade, forests, and indigenous rights provides a small glimpse into the complexities and controversies when trying to integrate social equity into environmental policymaking. This panel will raise important issues about who gets to define environmental problems, how conflict, values, history, and culture impacts the way in which we come to know things about the phenomenon of climate change, and how that really shapes environmental solutions. So why are we looking at California? Because some have said that California really represents a global laboratory in the fight against climate change. This is because California has consistently been at the forefront of broader US and global environmental action. As the 6th largest economy in in the world and the only U.S. state to adopt a comprehensive program on both regulatory and market-based mechanisms to address greenhouse gas emissions reduction, California really represents an important site of inquiry. While no subnational government can halt climate change alone, California has a long history of success and replication in its environmental policies. Over the last decades, California has signed memorandums of understanding with over 50 nation states and subnational governments throughout the world regarding climate change. These MOUs really encourage policy transfer and cooperation among these states and subnational governments. So internationally, a lot of local governments are looking towards California for lessons on developing cost-effective greenhouse gas reduction strategies that also benefit and safeguard low-income communities of color. So this brings us today, today's topic, California forest offsets in the Global South. And looking specifically at the social equity implications of offsets beyond California's borders. These proposed projects compensate governments and landowners of the Global South, in this case Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil, for preserving forests for their carbon sequestration capacities. California, mainstream environmentalists, businesses, and some indigenous groups support such offsets, again, beyond California's borders, because of its cost effectiveness in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, its the opportunities to provide ecological enhancements to tropical rainforests, and benefit sharing opportunities for some indigenous communities in the Global South. However, it's not so quite simple in terms of an environmental policy-making side. California environmental justice groups say not so fast. They actually are strongly opposed to international offsets in the Global South. They view this planned expansion as creating opportunities that are going to displace indigenous groups, potentially causing human rights violations, while at the same time perhaps having opportunities to allow businesses, polluters to continue to emit greenhouse gases and other harmful pollutants back home in California. So as you will see from this panel today and the conversation that we have of this real world proposed policy that's before the California Air Resources Board, which will be decided within the next couple of months, that these issues of how do you deal with equity, how do you deal with social implications of justice, human rights, both in the global south and the global north, are not easy things to do. So today we're going to see a real world context from different stakeholders. Today we have Michael Shaw from the business community, Mary Rose Taruc from the environmental justice community, Dan Nepstad from the conservation mainstream environmental community, and Senator Dean Florez, who represents both a policymaker and regulator in California. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panel speaker, Daniel Nepstad, who's both a scientist and a very acclaimed scholar. He's the executive director and senior scientist at the Earth Innovation Institute. Dan holds a Ph.D. in forest ecology from Yale University, so he's one of our alums here. He has worked in the Amazon for 30 years studying the effects of climate change, policy, and land use of Amazon forests, and was a founding president of the Amazon Environmental Research Institute. He's a world authority on red and low emission rural development, and he was previously senior scientist at Woods Hole Research Center and the chief program officer of environmental conservation at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He has also served on the Red Offset Working Group of California, which is one of the main groups that's proposing international offsets in the Global South for California's Cap and Trade program. And he was also one of the lead authors of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. So with that, if we can give Daniel a warm welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and it's great to be here. I see some familiar faces. Is that you, Gordon? Yeah. Hi, Gordon. And also Martin Ma here, a wonderful collaborator who runs one of the most amazing programs in China. But anyway, wonderful to be here. I have 10 minutes, I think, right, to sort of present one perspective on this issue. My basic message today is going to be, through this offset program, in California, we have an opportunity to really mainline eco-justice issues in the South. And I want to explain how I get to that conclusion, and I'll get right to the point. These are a quick structure of what I'm going to do. That's about 1 minute per item, so I'm going to move quickly here. The first issue, though, is how big is tropical deforestation in climate change? And if you look at estimates of gross emissions from the clear cutting and degradation of tropical forests around the world, it's about 20%. Some estimates up to 24%. But roughly half of that is reabsorbed from the atmosphere as those forests recover. So we've got about a 10% issue here. If we can decouple those two, though, and keep the recovery and slow the loss, we have a game changer. Working Group 3 of the IPCC fifth assessment concluded that up to 60% of the climate change solutions by 2030 could come from the land, including slowing deforestation and degradation, restoring forests, restoring soil carbon. So it's a big deal. And Brazil has shown that it's possible. Brazil's got close to 4.5 gigatons of emissions avoided because it's slowed deforestation in the Amazon almost 80%. The next point is that out of California's climate policy grew an invitation. In 2008, September, Schwarzenegger invited a bunch of governors to Los Angeles, and they launched the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, specifically around the prospect of this new forest carbon market being created through the international offset mechanism of California's climate policy called Global Warming Solutions Act. About half a dozen governors went there. I was in Jalisco, Mexico last week. We're now up to 35 governors who represent almost 1/3 of the world's tropical forests, most of the Amazon, most of Borneo, and most of Mexican forests are in this alliance, all created with the hope that one day there would be a financial mechanism for rewarding their efforts in slowing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The California International Offset Mechanism itself is quite special. We have to remember that there's not just one type of mechanism for doing forest carbon work. There's RED projects. RED stands for reductions in emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And then there's jurisdictional approaches, wall-to-wall approaches. What do we mean here? This is the approach that California decided on. Instead of linking up with individual projects, which give all sorts of room for gaming, for rights abuses, for basically leakage and those issues, let's define performance in emissions reductions across an entire state, an entire province, an entire county, and get all of the stakeholders, all of the sources into that calculation, do it really well, and that drives a process of building these issues into public policy and programs that are owned by regional societies, as opposed to this model where it's focused on a single community, a single concession, usually advanced by a project developer, often with a quick move to get indigenous folks to sign their rights off, and that's where carbon cowboys have flourished. This was rejected by California. The California sector-based offsets, we spent 24 months in the RED Offset Working Group, and a lot of these issues, frankly, are boring. So that's about 24 meetings focused on getting to recommendations that were really aimed at the Air and Resources Board. And some of the conclusions of that 24-month odyssey were a very high bar for social and environmental safeguards, a demonstration that the jurisdiction partnering with California is doing its own effort. It's not counting on California to foot the entire bill. A very robust approach to reference levels, in other words, baselines, at least 10 years of performance. That's what we defined as the basis of determining whether or not you've reduced emissions or not. And then very rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification procedures. So these are recommendations that have been largely incorporated into the staff reports of Air and Resources Board. Today, quite frankly, there's a single jurisdiction in the world that would make it over that bar. It's a high bar. And that jurisdiction is the state of Acre and the far western end of the Brazilian Amazon, borders on Peru and Bolivia. I started working there in 1990 at the invitation of the National Rubber Tappers Council, which grew out of Chico Mendez' legacy. And what is unique about Acre is that beginning in 1999, the government basically embodied the eco-justice movement of Acre in its policies and government programs. And one of the elements of that agenda is CISA. It's a statewide law that is to incentivize ecosystem services, beginning with carbon. And the first programs to get launched were the programs for Indigenous people and rubber tappers. There's new industries that have been developed. There's a subsidy that goes to rubber tappers for their harvest of native rubber. And I also sit on the science committee, and our job is to guide this process. One of the things we did recently was suggest that, you know, those projects want to come into the Acre system. They don't meet that bar. So the government took that recommendation and excluded a number of projects, mostly because they hadn't done deep enough consultation with the people on the ground who would be affected by those projects. The second in line is a state known as Mato Grosso. Mato Grosso is Brazil's agricultural champion, the biggest producer of most commodities coming out of Brazil. And the shortish-looking man you see on the right here is Pedro Takis. He has a 24-hour bodyguard because he's put so many people in jail for corruption. And when he took office in his first year, he said, we are going to have a statewide socially inclusive agenda. And he did it, and he announced that in Paris the day after this meeting. By the way, that's not his bodyguard. That's Jerry Brown to his left. Also, one of the early signatories to Jerry Brown's initiative Under 2 MOU, which now has almost 200 jurisdictions around the world. Included in Pedro's agenda is not just some smallholders getting technical assistance, but all of them. That's 103,000 families, and now the challenge is to make that happen. So they would be the next in line, partly because they have a statewide law that structures RED. So this would work then. You get a PG&E, that's one of our electrical companies in California, that has to reduce its emissions. It's already bought the allowances it can, and it wants to both lower its costs of delivering electricity, but also feed into a program that could give it some PR. And so it basically buys emissions reductions issued by Acre. Those are all registered. That money goes to one of the sub-programs. It could go to smallholders, as we illustrate here, or it could go to Indigenous people. And that helps PG&E comply with its mandate within the cap and trade of California. So in closing then, let's quickly review really what I see as the scientific basis for wanting to see this international offset system work. It would deforestation is going to go up. The new numbers for Brazil are sort of scary. So after this big decline, deforestation is going to come up. The reason is there has not been that positive international signal that was promised in LA in 2008, that was promised through the international UN process. The money has not materialized, okay? So we estimate that would double or triple the overall contribution of California's climate policy to climate change. And it would allow California to do good, basically, on the commitments that it made. It could initiate a domino effect. China is in California almost every month looking at the climate policy as it prepares to launch its climate policy nationally by the end of 2018. And if China were to build in a similar mechanism, suddenly we have a serious positive signal to these politically courageous governors who've stuck their necks out and risked losing elections, that what they're doing matters, because what they've already done is bigger than any other industrialized nation in the world. In effect, putting this into place would increase the chances that we keep the planet below 2 degrees. It's as simple as that. In terms of impacts on indigenous and traditional people, if you talk to the folks who are engaged in OCRI's programs, they want it. If you go to a report we just launched last week, we document how RED is challenging or benefiting indigenous folks and traditional communities in 13 different regions. And it's clear that enormous gains are being made when it's done through a jurisdictional approach. Project-based is a little more complicated. This mechanism is endorsed by COICA, which is the umbrella organization of the Amazon, AMPB, the umbrella organization for Mesoamerica, and many other indigenous groups. There is a very negative effect of eliminating international offsets on future electricity prices that would kick in some years post-2020 probably. Bloomberg's own modeling estimates that we're talking allowance prices that could get up to $70 a ton, and that all will get shifted over to consumers of electricity, and especially low-income consumers will feel that the worst in the absence of international offsets. Finally, effects on local pollution, a huge issue in California, an issue that needs to be fixed. We don't see the evidence that the international offset program would exacerbate that program. We just don't see the scientific evidence. There's programs like the stationary source permitting system that address that question directly. This is not a greenhouse gas issue, local pollution. It's a toxin issue, and there are policies and regulations designed to address those issues. Finally, would it be too much money leaving California? Well, first of all, California has made that pledge. It has invited everyone to come to California to sign agreements. It's signed the Rio Branco Declaration, which has come out of these tropical states, their commitment to lower deforestation. And it's time to do good on that promise. It's less than 10% of allowance revenues, even with a very large estimate of the cost of those offsets. It's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Next, I'd like to invite Mary Rose Taruc, who's the co-chair of the California Air Resources Board Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. Mary Rose has over 20 years of experience in environmental justice campaigns for clean air, affordable housing, renewable energy, and climate solutions at the local, state, national, international arenas. Under the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, APEN, she was a state organizing director. She coordinated statewide campaigns that included the Coalition for SB 535, which ensures that multi-billion-dollar California climate programs benefit environmental justice communities. She currently serves as the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to the State Air Board, and she provides input to the state's major climate laws to ensure social equity. She obtained her undergraduate degree in environmental science from UC Berkeley. So if we can give Mary Rose a round of applause. Thank you.
Hello, wonderful to be here. So home for me is in a guava tree in the Rice Bowl region of the Philippines. Home is also where my husband and 2 boys live in Oakland, California. 2 boys who I've spent many nights in emergency rooms for when their asthma flares up. And so I look at environmental policy. That's them right there. I look at environmental policy and ask, is this policy going to help or hurt these kids with asthma? Because asthma is a cause of industrial combustion, and there are all these public health effects that it has on communities that live in and around this problem. And so as a mom, I think it's my responsibility to make sure that the policies that I do take on and promote as a leader are ones that will be good for my kids and kids like them. Early on in my environmental justice career, I was exposed to the principles of environmental justice, and to me, there was so much in it that spoke to me around, we can't just create policies just in what's in front of us or what I know now. There's 500 years of history of colonization and genocide and slavery and industrialization that we're trying to undo. That isn't just environmental. It is environmental, but it is also social and economic issues that are tied to it. And so to me, when I work on environmental issues, I take to heart the principles of environmental justice. And so I'm going to tell you a story about how I heard about red and carbon offsets, forestry offsets. I was holding up a no red sign in Cancun, Mexico, a few years ago. And for holding up that sign, I was detained by the United Nations Security. It was at a climate conference, one of the climate summits in Cancun. And I was detained and tossed out of the negotiations, and you would think I would be afraid after that, after that experience, but actually I was encouraged. I was encouraged because to the right of me at that protest was the chief negotiator for the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. To the left of me were leaders of social movements from the Western Hemisphere, from the MST of Brazil to La Via Campesina of Mexico and throughout the world that have millions of members. And in front of me were Indigenous brothers and sisters from the Indigenous Environmental Network who have been campaigning to end these red offsets because of the land grab that they see happening and the threat of it in international communities. Because we are in the United States and you're at Yale and you're at this privileged place, and the mindset of private property to you and what you're used to is normal. But to Indigenous communities and forest dwelling communities, communal property and not having title to the land is more of what they're used to. And so these projects for offsets around owning land, having title to it, and being able to sell off that credit is completely foreign to a lot of folks. And so it was important for me to take what I was learning from these international Indigenous leaders to take it back to California. And so it's with that spirit that we as a movement for environmental justice in California have been opposing these international forestry offsets. To us, AB 32, our Global Warming Solutions Act, is so important and exciting because you see on the right, those represent hundreds of polluting facilities in California, and those are where we live. Low income, Black folks, brown folks, Asian folks, and AB 32 is a promise to reduce this pollution that we've been dealing with and trying to solve for decades. And so, when we heard of offsets and the offsets being done some other place and not these emissions reductions directly in our communities, we're like, what is that? We couldn't support that. And so, so the excitement for AB 32 was easily, we were confused why the state would do that. And to me as a mom, like, why would I want offsets that were somewhere else and not in the communities where my kids were being poisoned? And so it was important for us to see those emissions reductions locally where they exist and for the communities that have been exposed to this for decades and generations. And so to us, offsets are actually a distraction. Had anybody seen the story of Stuff? Yeah, so there's also the story of cap and trade, and so it talks about carbon, these carbon offsets and carbon trading and as distractions to what we really need to do. Because if you really do the math, and keeping fossil fuels in the ground, because we don't have a lot of time, we need to stop extraction of these fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. and keep them in the ground, and then also limit combustion. So AB 32 to us, so this is a graph representing how much emissions California is planning to reduce. And so it looks at the three benchmark dates that we have in our climate policy. And so if you look at the emissions that we've had so far and where we're going for our 2020 targets, we're trying to keep at bay about where we were in 1990, right, for the 2020 targets. And so just last week, Governor Brown signed SB 32 to extend our climate laws to make sure that we are 40% below 1990 levels in 2030, and then there's the even steeper target for 2050. And so if California has been a leader in climate policy in these last 10 years since we enacted AB 32, think about in the next 15 years, we have to be 4 times better in order to reach that target. And so we have no room for distractions, right? We have to reduce emissions and reduce them boldly. And so, so we want to see the real solutions to climate change. To us, like I said, the way the environmental justice movement has framed these issues is a confluence of environmental, economic, and social issues that have been around and that we've been dealing with for several hundred years, and that our solutions, anybody heard of the Climate Gap Report? Oh, it's very California. Good job. A+ for you. Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California and those environmental justice researchers looked at the climate gap. And so to us, the way you close the climate gap is looking at who is impacted by climate change. So that low-income communities of color are actually first and worst hit by climate change. And so we suffer more from extreme weather events. We breathe dirtier air because that's where these emissions these polluting facilities are at. That over time we're going to pay even more for basic necessities and become economic problems. And our jobs, some of these low-wage jobs, we will have less economic opportunities to do that. And so in order for us to move forward in climate policy to address these issues, we have to address these issues. And so California has actually been one of the first steps in addressing these climate issues for environmental justice, low-income communities of color, is to map out where environmental justice communities are at. So we have this CalEnviro screen map. It's amazing. It's one of our best tools that the environmental justice movement has gifted to California and to the world. Looks at where the highest poverty and pollution is at. And so it's in California, we use so they use a scoring system, and so the top 25% of census tracts that are run through this tool is where we identify as EJ communities or disadvantaged communities. And so you'll see the Central Valley, LA, that Southern California region as big places for opportunity to clean up. And so we also know that we can direct climate programs and investments in these areas. And so I was part of a coalition of groups that were able to pass SB 535. Senator De Leon, who is now the president of the California State Senate, was the author of this. And we're like, we can't just be, we have to take our environmental ideas with what communities are interested in doing as projects. And so we identified these 5 initial programs from community greening or urban forestry, energy efficiency and renewable energy, transit operations, so public transit, and then transit-oriented development that included building affordable housing, equitable development in these transit hubs to be where we wanted these investments to go. Just a snapshot of, so even, the first year, for instance, sustainable communities where they're building affordable housing at transit got $100 million. Fire prevention and forestry projects got urban forestry projects got $50 million, $80 million in energy efficiency, and basically free solar panels on low-income homes have all been possible through this climate fund called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so we think that those are solutions that we should continue to promote. These are two groups that have gotten funding through the Urban Forestry Program. Urban Relief out of Oakland primarily work with at-risk African American youth, and Korean Youth Community Center in LA, where they're planting trees in these concrete jungles of LA. Have any of you planted trees and have done urban forestry projects before? I heard that might be part of your mod requirement. So you would think that could be cool to support or invest in as part of, if there were AB 32 programs to fund that, including maybe, offsets. And actually, they tried it in California, and then they discontinued. They basically closed down the program because greenhouse gas reduction and involving community and reducing emissions locally is not what the climate offsets are about. The offsets program of the Air Resources Board and under AB 32 is about cost containment, meaning making it cheaper for polluters to comply with the law. And so these kinds of programs are too expensive because right now California's carbon price is about $12 per ton. So if you had 12 bucks in your pocket right now, you could buy a metric ton of carbon. And so it's pretty cheap, right? Pretty cheap. And offsets are even cheaper than that. And so the offsets program is about making it cheaper for these polluters to pollute. So just to give you an idea about who's using offsets, so Dan mentioned PG&E, you see number 6. So the biggest oil companies and the biggest electricity companies in California are actually the biggest users of offsets. And those are huge environmental justice communities that live next to that. And 90% of these offsets are located outside of California. And so if AB 32 is about reducing emissions for California, this offsets program is doing the opposite of that. It makes us mad. So I'll show you three pictures of, so Chevron, 1.6 million tons of offsets used in this last year. That's 1.6 million tons of carbon and co-pollutants that did not get cleaned up in our communities in Richmond, California, and actually more outside of California. This is what these industries look like in our communities. Gas power plant in Pittsburgh, oil refinery in Wilmington, California. There's multiple refineries in the city of Wilmington. It's a district in LA. 1.3 million tons of offsets used, and instead of cleaning up locally. That is what these offsets mean. And so instead of those offsets, we actually have solutions in California, solutions for cleaning up toxic hotspots and instead creating healthy hoods. The California Environmental Justice Alliance have this Green Zones program. We have just last year we passed a bill that would dedicate $1 billion to installing solar in affordable housing buildings. You can turn in your clunker car and get a voucher for an electric vehicle or transit pass instead of red offsets. And as a mom, I want my kids to be part of the solutions and to promote these programs that are good for environment, good for economy, and good for and lead with equity, because we have more problems to solve than just environmental problems, and there's this opportunity to fix the climate crisis alongside social justice, environmental justice issues, and economic justice principles.
Thank you, Mary Rose. So we saw two very different types of perspectives on international offset. The first presentation really focused on conservation, market environmentalism type of approach, benefit sharing, and also ecological benefits to tropical rainforests. And then secondly, we saw a perspective from domestically looking at what offsets means in local communities, asking for calls for direct regulatory investment within communities and not offshoring them to other locations. So with that, now we're going to have a different perspective perspective, looking at the business community, looking at the actual communities, the sector of industry that are creating some of this pollution, and how they support or why they support offsets in terms of complying with California's climate change laws. And with that, I'd like to introduce Michael Shaw. He's the Vice President of Government Relations for the California Manufacturing and Technology Association. Michael oversees the legislative and regulatory agenda for California manufacturers and manages the CMTA lobbying team. He was most recently Vice President of External Affairs for the California Trucking Association after serving as Legislative Director for the National Federation of Independent Businesses and as a lobbyist for the California Chamber of Commerce. Michael has extensive experience in areas of climate change, healthcare, tort reform, and workers' compensation, and he has worked for a number of statewide political races and initiative campaigns. He's a graduate of California State University, Sacramento, with a BA in government. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me as well. I think the name might have had something to do with it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here at Yale, obviously an educational institution of significant renown, where a number of the future leaders, both environmentally and economically, will be coming from, and an opportunity for you to hear a slightly different perspective, on these issues. We had a great opportunity to have lunch today, and I appreciate the discussion that we had, because I realize as I get older, there are many other perspectives on issues that I didn't grow up with. I didn't have an opportunity to be exposed to necessarily, not because of necessarily an active choice, but just it wasn't part of my growing up experience. So I learned that there's great value in different perspectives. And so my time is brief. I'm going to get right into it, but I just wanted to say that everything that we say today, I ultimately want to put it under the umbrella of, I do not think that what we're talking about is mutually opposed. We're not saying that this is a choice of one versus the other. The question is, there is an issue we need to deal with in climate change. How do we go about doing that so that we protect both the environment and the economy as well? Because we know that if we are not successful, and I'm speaking from a California perspective, in setting up a system that helps do this effectively and cost effectively and ultimately effective in its goal, then the rest of the world is going to learn from that, and they're not going to follow the path that California is on. So we want to make sure that when we do it well, and we do it right. Ultimately, climate change it's a global problem, and it really needs to have global solutions. And so California being 1% of global emissions, if we shut down every industry, every piece of economic activity, we did not have any cars on the road, we got rid of all the cows and everything, we would still have a significant climate change problem on the planet. So that is not going to be our solution to doing this. How can we do it better? Well, we can look at ways that we can ultimately effectively reduce our emissions, be a good example for the rest of the world, as I mentioned in my opening. And that is going to be a way that we get everybody to participate in this issue, in the solution, in the global solution. And I think in the intro, it was mentioned that California's initial law in this area, AB 32, which was titled the California Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, global warming solutions. So we need to have a global perspective on this. It's also important to note that greenhouse gas emissions and criteria pollutants, while having some relationship, are not one and the same. CO2 and criteria pollutants such as carbon, soot, are not the same, and we need to keep those issues not separate necessarily in that we can't talk about them together, but they are not having the same impact on the climate change issue that we face and we're trying to address. Cost effectiveness, as I said earlier, is also necessary for us to address. The offsets, the international offsets that we're talking about today, are an opportunity to help keep that at a level that is manageable for industry to be effective in taking on those offsets and ultimately funding those projects, both within the United States, in California, in our communities, as well as outside of California's borders and in the United States international borders. It's an opportunity through that to be effective in being, again, a good example, a leader in this area. And a leader, part of the definition, I think, of being a leader is having followers. Right now, California is out in front on a lot of these issues, and we look back and we see very few have joined us in this cap-and-trade program that we've created in California. We've got one province in Canada, Quebec. Ontario is also looking at it, and there's some interest from others. The state of Washington, for instance, has decided that they don't want to fully participate in the program, but they're interested in taking some of the allowances out of our program to apply in their program. So there's lots of ways that we can do this better, but again, we need to make sure that we're doing it effectively within California, again, to be that good example around the world. There's also economic opportunity that goes along with this, both here and there. And by here, I'm referring, specifically to California and the United States. But here, there's opportunity in the offsets because we can look at ways to, again, if we're doing this in a cost-effective way, to fund energy efficiency programs. Manufacturers, are very energy-intensive industry, generally speaking, be it natural gas, be it electricity, or other forms of energy. So if they're able to successfully adopt more energy-efficient processes and purchase more energy-efficient equipment, they can implement that in their processes and ultimately produce a better product at a more energy-efficient level. There was a study released earlier this year, which was an update to a study that had been released a few years before, looking at the energy efficiency of industry around the world. And it found that California was second only to France in energy efficiency in terms of production. Now, France is really a bit of an outlier here because of the reliance on nuclear energy, which has opportunity and issues with it as well. But basically what the message is, California is the most energy efficient manufacturing state in the nation and for the most part the world. So there's opportunity for us in that. There's also opportunity in transportation. If we're doing this cost effectively, again, there's an opportunity for energy to be produced at manufacturing facilities that might be available on the grid, which can then be a part of our funding or fueling, so to speak, of an electric transportation system. So there's opportunity there. There's opportunity overseas in funding projects like in Brazil and Mexico and other parts of the world where deforestation is an issue, where we can help support the local economies and present an alternative and help be a part of funding an alternative there that can help those local economies grow, as well creating more opportunity there, as well as addressing the issue of deforestation and forest degradation that can ultimately be part of that solution for our global issue of climate change. And that's ultimately what I think bringing these main points together is we can be aggressive in addressing climate change, but we also have to be realistic. We have to understand that industry, is an important partner in this discussion. Industry is going to be a big part of the solution, one way or the other. And then the question is, do we want to be successful in creating those jobs and economic opportunity that go along with that? And by the way, it has been, I think fairly conclusively proven in research regarding public health that having a job is a significant part of an individual's health outcomes. It means that you generally have the resource, and by having a job, I mean a good paying job, of course. If you have a good paying job, you generally, might have health insurance, hopefully. You'll be able to provide healthy foods and opportunities for your family. You might be able to access recreational activities and exercise that can also help improve health outcomes. So this is an important aspect to consider as well when we're talking about these larger solutions. We want the industry to be successful, producing both the opportunity economically as well as being a part of the environmental solution. So I look forward to the discussion to come and appreciate the opportunity to be here and thank Yale Forestry Environmental Studies School for having me out here as well. It's a great opportunity to see the future as I look out here. I do have 3 young children of my own, 10, 7, and 6, and I do think about that when I work on these issues because it is a part of what my future and my children's future is going to be. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very interesting perspective looking at why the business community views offsets as necessary to enable industry to comply with California's rigorous environmental laws. Next, we're going to hear from from the regulator that's actually crafting and working on implementing some of those rigorous laws that California has on climate change and air quality. We have here Senator Dean Florez, who's a member of the California Air Resources Board. Senator Florez is a proven leader in air quality arena, having served as the past chairman of the California Senate Select Committee on Air Quality. While in the Senate, he authored a series of groundbreaking anti-pollution laws focused on the San Joaquin Valley, that's the Central Valley of California, the agricultural heartland of the state, and its dirty air, and repealed the agricultural industry's historic exemption from air operating permits that lasted for 63 years. Senator Florez served in the California Assembly from 1998 to 2002, and in the Senate from 2002 to 2010, representing the Central Valley, including Bakersfield, Fresno, and 18 other cities. Senator Florez is now president and CEO of Balance Public Relations, which specializes in education and technology. He's a former investment banker, and he received his MBA from Harvard in 1993 and earned his BA on political science from UCLA. So with that, I'd like to welcome Senator Florez.
Do you guys mind if I sit? Because if you give a past politician a microphone and stand, we'll be here all night. So I just want to say, don't want to do that. First, thank you for inviting this entire panel of Californians to Yale. We understand the weather's like this constantly, so we'll be back. Absolutely. Or we'll invite you out around February. How's that? Will that work? First and foremost, thank you for inviting me, Michael, and thank you to the school. I'm very fortunate to have one of my past colleagues and classmates, Rick Rivesca's here, who is your provost now. He started here about 1998. I went to the legislature in 1998. I lost my hair. He got better looking, so I'm not sure why that works. It must be the environment here. But thank you for having us. As Michael said, as a regulator, it's really interesting to sit here, to be a past legislator passing cap and trade or passing AB 32, and I'll make a distinction there very quickly. And then now on the Air Board as a regulator. It's a very interesting thing to be a legislator and a regulator. So let me start with why we passed AB 32. What was the genesis? And I think even before 2008 was a discussion about climate change. Al Gore may have invented it or not, but let's just start by saying that conversation started very early in the Clinton administration. In California, being California, we wanted to lead. So when we passed this bill in 2006, and yes, I did vote for it, even coming from a very oil-rich community like Kern County, very tough vote for a lot of members, still a tough vote for a lot of moderate members in California. But that bill basically said that we had to layer on climate change onto what was already the Air Board's charge on pollution. So remember, we always had an air board. We were always dealing with pollution. But in 2006, there was another layer added, and that is climate change. So I think it's important to note that in some sense, we're trying to solve two problems. In some way, we're trying to do it in some similar manner. But how we get there is quite different. The issues in Wilmington and the issues in inner city communities, heavy with pollution, in Fresno, where literally 4 out of 7 kids carry an inhaler. They're not that concerned what's going on in Paris. They're not that concerned what's going on with climate change. They want to know what it's going to take to clean the air. So when you put these two programs together and you give a board a charge, it's very interesting. I can tell you that my short time on the board has been one where I have asked the question publicly, are we trying to save California or are we trying to save the world? And in some sense, the answer may be both. But as we begin this conversation today about offsets, it really brings it to bear. So let me, first and foremost say that our climate change, our cap and trade system that the ARB chose, not the legislature, the ARB chose to use this mechanism, that's new. We only have 2 data points on this. We basically have 2013 and 2014. We're about to have another data point in 2015. So know that although it is a preference program, a market mechanism, there's very little data on it, and it is a preferred program. I mean, it took a lot of negotiation, a lot of people coming to the table, and trying to figure out what would be the best way to actually take us to these new limits that then Governor Schwarzenegger, now Jerry Brown, is signed off on. I can tell you that when it comes to the offset, linkages is the name of the game for the board. The board isn't operating out there in any sense without any guidance. So don't think that as a board member that somehow we have the ability to, and in essence, make a final choice on what partnerships we will move towards. We are obviously having workshops. We're obviously having discussions, but the governor and the Attorney General, under a bill that was passed, which was Senate Bill 1018, really laid out about 4 criteria, and I just want to make sure you understand what those are. So we joined with a LINK program. It has to have an equivalent or stricter standard than we currently have in our own domestic cap and trade program. That means some of the highest standards you're ever going to find. It has to be able to work with our cap and trade system here domestically. It has to be enforceable. And it cannot impose any liability at all to the state. So we have these 4 giant pillars that this program that we're discussing actually has to move towards and through. And the board, has been noted, we have had a white paper on this. I believe the last one is 2015, officially. The board is contemplating what would be our offset program internationally. We've missed the first 2 periods. So we're now in the 3rd compliance period now. In the rules that were being contemplated, we would allow a industry participant, I won't call them polluters, but an industry participant to, in essence, take up to 2% of their total and utilize it for offsets. So now we find ourselves in this new compliance period, the 3rd period, that's 2018 to 2020, with a discussion at the Air Board of whether or not we should proceed on. I think it's been mentioned by those programs that have been vetted very seriously by the Air Board, by the Governor, by the Attorney General. You heard 2 today that are at the very top of the list. And I can tell you, which has a lot of conversation at the Air Board, a lot of conversation among the Governor's office and the legislature about what will be the offset program. In California, we've had a very rigorous debate about climate change this last session. I can tell you that if I can read the political tea leaves, the main conversation will be about this topic in California. It will be whether or not Governor Brown, the Attorney General, the Air Board, the EJ groups, regulated industries, and can find partners in the world that will not seriously hurt communities in which we are working with offset programs. So in other words, if you're looking at examples, we've heard 2 pretty good examples. If you're looking other places, you can find some very bad examples where folks in those indigenous communities, we think we have a partner. The folks that are used to working in those areas can't enter. They can't do what they normally have done. Commerce is reduced. Lives are hurt. And I can tell you right now, as a member of the Air Board, I'm going to just put my hat on as not the official representative. I'm very, very concerned with that. I want to make sure that we have partnerships where the communities themselves are at the table, and not the governments and not the representatives, but the communities themselves. And that's very hard to do, but it's the kind of vetting I think we're going to have in discussion at the Air Board to move this forward. I will say that the program itself brings us to an inflection point. I think Mary Rose hit that. Let me just kind of tell you what it is. And that is, if we have regulated industries who say, we like the offset program, it worries me a bit. It worries me only in the sense that we want to make sure that we have offsets that, as I mentioned, work for those communities, but we aren't offering a way out of good old-fashioned air pollution here in the United States and here in California. So if there are domestic programs where we can buy offsets, and right now I can tell you we have not utilized all of those. So right now we still have those available. You know those in some tribal areas with some forestry issues in the United States. We know some of these is some pig farms somewhere in the mid-United States, but the bottom line is we are utilizing offsets in a domestic way. The statistics tell us that we may be out of those offsets, so now we turn our attention to the international offset market. And the real question will be whether or not they're rigorous enough, the protections are rigorous enough for us to move in that direction. Overall, the big question is whether or not buying an offset anywhere, domestically, internationally, allows a polluter to pollute a little longer. That is really the crux of the question. And for me as a board member, that's going to be one of the questions, many questions I have as this item comes up to the Air Board for full discussion. And, I think the staff thus far knows that this is a very political question before it is really truly a policy question. It's whether or not, as Mary Rose laid out, whether or not we're going to allow offsets that are somewhat cheaper, and in some sense, yet will have a bigger impact for the world. So let me go back to the California or the world. It is true, 15 to 20% of our problem can be solved worldwide by good investment in these areas. It is also true that California basically has 1% of the entire issue. The real question for the board will be whether or not this investment truly lets a regulated industry off the hook. If it truly allows them to buy something there that solves an issue and is cheaper, but yet allows them to not maybe move as quickly and hard as they could here in good old California or in some of the regulated communities like Wilmington or the Central Valley where dairies are at, or in Oakland where we have severe problems. That's going to be the real question. So I hope you've heard all of these points. We're going to make a decision in California pretty soon. I just want to give you at least my opinion on it, is that the protections are there, they're strong, they're stringent, they will have the utmost of due diligence, but we will still come down to the question of whether or not that is the best solution for the communities that are most impacted in California, and that would be the disadvantaged communities. So I hope you guys have some good questions around that, but I really appreciate the forum, and I hope you folks will please, Rick's going to send everybody out in February to California. We'll rehuddle on all this, but thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. So that was a good framing, California or the world. What responsibility should California take in terms of its global climate leadership? Should it be focused on domestic reductions at home in environmental justice communities, as Mary Rose mentioned, or should it be at a larger part of a larger climate regime and help provide benefits to the indigenous communities in the global south, as well as provide ecological integrity type of projects in preserving tropical forests? And is there an opportunity to provide cost effectiveness, making sure that California businesses are not moving out of California because they're not able to comply with California's rigorous law? So these are all very complex questions. How does equity, how does social implications factor into the environmental policymaking, and how do we maintain our businesses within the state as well? So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. I know this being the forestry school, I hope there would be some interesting questions about this innovative and controversial project.
Hello, I'm Nino Jordan. I'm a Ph.D. student from UCL. I'm visiting here at the moment. So I found Daniel Nepstad. I found your contribution really informative, and I think there's a really good case for it to be a very cost-effective solution to reducing climate change emissions. But so that it's a bit of a static effect. So I wonder, how do you see that in terms of the mobilization of political constituencies? Because, for example, if you implement RED Plus in Brazil, for example, we would generate an interest group for keeping up RED Plus in Brazil. Meanwhile, I see, as you mentioned, there may be less pressure on electricity supply in California, so there may be less. Maybe we will have less production of renewable energy, so there may be less of industrial transformation, and maybe Michael Shaw's constituency might be less interested in producing more renewable energy. So how do you see the dynamic effect over time in terms of entrenching interest for industrial transformation and for reaching high levels of ambition?
Hello. I don't know if you noticed Marie Rose's slide, but California has committed and signed a greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 40% below the 1990 by 2030. That is squeezing the electricity sector in a major way. By 2025, predictions are that the average burden per household is going to go up at least $1,000. That's the latest modeling I've seen. And that's assuming that there's 4% offsets, okay? If you take away offsets, we don't know what that electricity price looks like. So I think we have, that's an environmental justice issue in my view. I think in Brazil, Brazil's basically reduced deforestation in the Amazon through command and control measures. It's creating farmer fear of being in prison, being cut out of markets, being cut off from agricultural credit. That approach is unsustainable. They need real positive incentives coming in. If there's a California market created, there would suddenly be electricity, not to borrow from the other side of the equation, but running through indigenous movements, smallholders, and the entire environmental agenda in Brazil. And I see these as mutually reinforcing. I will soon have my 4th child, and if I want them to be in a world that's not going to have a really dangerous world with climate change, I say make offsets implemented, because that's how we're going to fix climate change globally. And I'll stop there.
And I think it's also worth noting that California has on the books already a requirement to reach 50% from what we call the renewable portfolio standard. So it's renewable energy production by 2030 as well. So we're not, I mean, there's already a law in place to make sure that we're continuing to push the envelope on that. And I guarantee you, but well before we get to 2030, we're going to have a law that's going to push that beyond 50%. So, it is not an issue that is, it's not a choice of one versus the other. It's going to continue to happen that way anyhow.
Thanks. Stefano Cartini, I'm a postdoc here at F&ES. So my question concerns the issue of saving California, saving the world. So I understand that California wants to introduce some abatement targets. So once these targets will be in the law, I guess to the extent that the government has to comply with its commitment, I guess that California will be bound to save the world to the extent of these targets. Then the question is whether it also tries to save California while saving the world. So in this type of situation, it's rather a question of cost effectiveness, whether to use offsets or not. I would like to know whether you have any information on the costs of the policy. And when I mention the costs, I would like to know, compared to a counterfactual with local pollution protection. So I guess in this type of situation, the counterfactual doesn't imply that there aren't offsets, but either there are offsets and local instruments fighting pollution, or local projects trying to solve both, which may be more costly.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think the paradigm that you've laid out in terms of how to look at it, clearly the airport's looking at it that way. I will say, though, even though we have, in some sense, the regulations, the hard medicine on the regulated industries that move us towards that pollution, there is a sense that when you have offsets, even 1%, 2%, 4%, and those are, in essence, allowing you to continue operations as is by buying credits somewhere else. And I do get that it is helping in the world situation. The balance for the board is really to ask the question whether or not that particular type of approach, in some sense, is going to be hurtful to a community. Let's say it's near a dairy, and that would prevent that particular entity from making the necessary changes to their technology, utilizing those dollars for that. It's a hard one. I mean, I can tell you, not to sound as an isolationist, that somehow California sits outside of the world and that we shouldn't lead other nations, in which we are, that they've been mentioned. We've led a lot of countries by example. And I'm not saying that the board would be, in essence, retreating from that. I will say that there is great concern, at least from myself, and a few others, that want to make sure that if we're going to move in that direction, that we have some sense of, how those communities are going to be treated, whether we're being socially responsible. It's great that we're not investing in projects, that we are investing alongside others. The pool approach, one might say, works. Sometimes, California should be leading that even more stringently, which I think we are. But that is also somewhat worrisome. I will say that trying to find domestic offsets, things that might make some sense here in our particular state and maybe in the neighboring states, is also, should also be continued to be looked at. It really comes down to whether or not it's in some point in time whether the cap and trade system is a workable system as opposed to a carbon tax, for example. So, this is the system we have now. It seems to be pushing us towards lower emissions, which is great. The sharing of resources is also another issue. Mary Rose mentioned AB 535, which moved historic legislation passed the same year as the prior bill, money to disadvantaged communities to offset themselves some of those. The international program doesn't have that for the disadvantaged communities in the states. It is the program itself that decides how to disperse those funds. I don't think there's been a 535 for international offsets here in California. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that's been worked in terms of how those dollars are actually allocated. 535 dollars have very little or nothing to do with the international offset program itself. And I think for communities who may not see the technology spending, that may be of concern as well. I'm not sure how to get to that. I do know it might help an indigenous community in another area, but again, it's where those dollars could be spent and how efficiencies could be utilized here in the States.
And Senator, if I can do a follow-up question. I understand the perspective that you're providing here about focusing on domestically on California and communities that are burdened. As California is a large economy, a large polluter of greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants, does California have any responsibility globally to assist communities meet the challenges of climate change and the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt with the amount of visitors from China that come to the Air Board every week, trying to figure out how to replicate what we're doing in California, and given the impact that particular country could have, as a leader and as a partnership with 4 or 5 countries in similar states, I think it could be huge overall. And I don't think that California should somehow walk back from that. I do think that we should try to figure out another way, a better way, to look at the percentages that are allocated, 2%, now 4% in the third compliance period. I mean, those need to be looked at a little more carefully and try to figure out how we can actually participate, but yet not send the dollars necessarily to places where we could be utilizing some of those dollars for communities that really need basic things. Some retrofits of some biomass facilities. We have biomass facilities running in Central Valley dirty, super dirty, so much so that they're closing down. I mean, how do we spend those dollars? Do you buy an offset, or do you fix the machinery next to the folks in Delano, where folks are today. You know, ways like that, I think, are kind of what I'm thinking about, and hopefully some of the board will be debating.
Any questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm a second-year student here, also from California, so I might ask a hard question. It's kind of more directed to you, Michael. You talked about California being a leader in energy efficiency, but at the same time, Marie-Rose mentioned the price of carbon is currently hovering around $12, and cap and trade is only supposed to be responsible for a small part of the emission reductions needed to achieve AB 32, roughly 15%. And so with this artificially high cap, and in my view, essentially industry can kind of just proceed business as usual, given their energy efficient ways, but proceed business as usual with their production and associated emissions. I'm wondering if the businesses that you represent have been doing anything given cap and trade in terms of trying to advance the goals of AB 32. In other words, how are they shifting operations to reduce their gross emissions and not just keep advancing in this energy efficient metric? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there are implementing a number of different technologies and process changes to be more efficient. They're finding ways to utilize. I'll bring in one example. Combined heat and power, is an interesting opportunity here. A number of our members use a lot of natural gas because they're in various food processing, aerospace, other areas where they need the heat from that. But then they can also use that excess heat that would otherwise just be released into the environment, or they'd have to, deal with somehow to produce electricity yet for use at the facility. So now they're getting really a more energy efficient use of the natural gas that they need to use as a part of their process. There are other things that we can do, haven't done yet, but it's on being under discussion with the California Public Utilities Commission. Deals with the rate structure that we have in California for our electricity rates. Because of our push for higher and higher levels of renewables, we find that an increasingly significant number of days and portions of the day, we're generating more renewable energy than we can consume, or generating more electricity, renewables being a part of that, than we can consume in California, which puts us in a situation where the generators then have to either sell at a lower price that energy out of California, or in some cases actually pay utilities out of the state to take the electricity that we have as Californians have paid to produce. So by changing the rate structure, in some cases manufacturers can ramp up their production during those peak hours of the day to produce more, which if they're incentivized properly would allow them to be a part of the solution, so that we're not ultimately selling at a lower price or paying someone else to take the electricity that we produce in California. There's also an effort underway regarding regionalization, and now we're stepping a little bit outside of manufacturing into a much bigger perspective. But there's an opportunity by creating tying in with other states, our electrical grid, to share some of that renewable energy at the times of day where we are producing more solar, and they're starting to see their peak usage increase in the evening when folks get home and start turning on all the devices and everything. And likewise, when say Wyoming or another state is producing a lot of solar or wind, we can bring that into California when we are seeing that same peak usage increase in the evening. And as being one who grew up in Southern California, there's also just a mental shift that needs to take place in really everyone's thinking. When I grew up, we were told not to turn on the air conditioner during the day. We were told to wait till like 7 o'clock at night to turn on the dishwasher or the clothes washer and all those appliances. And now we're effectively in a spot where we're telling people to do the exact opposite. And so we need to realign the rate structures that for electricity as well, to help incentivize this. And technology creates a very interesting opportunity, both at home and at work, for us to do that as well, because we now have time of use data, monitoring of equipment, can help be a big part of that as well. So there's a lot of opportunity. Also wanted to note, and I think Daniel said this earlier, we have air quality laws in place in California that are driving down criteria of pollutant emissions, and we've been very successful on that front. So it's not to say that if we don't do something here that we're not doing anything elsewhere, because we have a number of clean air laws both in California and nationally, that are going to drive some of that. So I just wanted to tag on to the end of that question there, that statement that we are doing a lot in this area too, and we have seen great success. LA looks nothing like it did 20, 30 years ago, and that's a big credit to the efforts that have been undertaken on the air quality side too.
I'd like to ask a question to Dan in terms of specific on indigenous rights. The state of California signed various MOU agreements with these states and the governors to start a process to study these forest offsets in the global south. And you mentioned the approach that the Red Offset Working Group has recommended is a jurisdictional approach versus a project-by-project base. Could you explain a little bit more about how do you achieve, in a jurisdictional basis, how do you achieve prior and informed consent of these indigenous communities to participate in the offset program?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you hear me? First of all, it's the international sector-based offset provision in AB 32. In other words, that it's not a recommendation from Roe. That was a decision made by the legislature. And so the question is, how do you go from that commitment into the rules for how offsets would come into California? Free, prior, and informed consent comes under the broader umbrella of social and environmental safeguards, which was that section of our process was led by someone from the Ford Foundation who was deeply immersed in those issues. And the big question becomes, how do you do FPIC across an area that is 5 times the size of Connecticut when you've got 23 indigenous groups and numerous rubber tapper groups that are, some of them take 5 days to get to a city. And the question, that is itself, I think, a great challenge. ACRI approached it by spending a year and a half having hundreds of meetings. And out of those meetings grew the critical needs and aspirations that went into the Indigenous Peoples sub-program of the ACRI's statewide agenda. And Hondonia is approaching it in a very different way. Mato Grosso has 43 indigenous tribes, and those tribes have said how they think the consultation should take place. It's going to be a 2-year process, and it's going to cost more than $500,000. And so I think this is a very new field. What really gets me excited about it, though, is it's mainstreaming environmental justice issues in the tropics. Instead of going from, we have a little project over here or a project over there, it's basically saying every community, every tribe should have a say in what that statewide program looks like, and knowing that there's California that has established this very high bar for the performance of those tropical forest programs.
I want to say, I wouldn't call it an environmental justice project that you can spread when environmental justice groups are saying for ourselves that these are environmentally racist programs. We don't think that taking them out into these international communities is actually going to necessarily empower them. Maybe there are processes that empower them to make decisions locally, and that is a good public participation process, but the offsets program in red is not an environmental justice program. And I want to also say that one of the things that I'm seeing in California is that the Air Resources Board is the primary climate agency in California, and the Air Resources Board, as I have started to see who they are mainly scientists types who are put in place to regulate air pollution and air issues. And so when you layer this international program or even an economic carbon trading program to these air scientists, like, how can you expect them to know how to run carbon trading programs, know what the loopholes are to make sure that they aren't negatively affecting people when they're primarily air scientists there? And so when you layer an international relations, like UN type program onto the responsibility of the Air Resources Board, they are not equipped to do that. And so how can you run that program from California, being able to monitor what's happening in Acre or some other place, that's actually happening? And so how are you going to fund that? That is a program that's set to fail.
Well, I think there's one thing that Mary Rose and I can agree on, I think amongst others, but, it is the fact that, ARB, has set up, they're scientists, they're not economists. They try and work with economists to try and put together a program around this and other issues, and we've, have differences with the approach that ARB has taken as well. So it's not as if industry is looking, to take advantage of a program that we think, we got one over on ARB. We're looking at it as, we have a program that we need to figure out how to make better on the cap and trade side in particular, and and how this ties in with that program is ultimately also going to be a component where industry is very interested in the outcome because we want it to work. We know that ARB has the authority now to go beyond what they had for 2020 under AB 32. They now have a goal of 40% below 1990 levels that they have to meet. And if we do not have an effective cap and trade program to go along with that, along with the international offsets as well and other programs, it's going to be a much more costly prospect for industry to be compliant with. And that's going to have very negative effects on their investments in California. I don't have the data to share with you on a slide right now, but we do have indications that manufacturing investments are dropping significantly. We're lagging far behind in the nation in job growth, in the state of California, I should say, lagging far behind the rest of the nation in job growth and investments in the manufacturing sector. And that is not entirely. Don't want to put all of the, don't want anybody to think I'm pointing all to climate change, but it is a component because it does affect energy prices and other activities in the state that is having an effect as well. So, we want a program, a cap and trade program that works well. And we want the availability of international offsets that work well and are very sensitive, to the issues that Mary Rose and others have raised around this. So we want to make sure that it's protecting both the economy and the environment at the same time. It's a hard target to hit.
I think we can take maybe 2 more questions back there.
Thank you so much. My name is Lihi Yona. I'm a first-year MESC student here, and I'm really interested in stakeholder engagement when it comes to policymaking and how we engage frontline impacted communities, specifically youth and women, when it comes to these issues. So this is a question directed at Mary Rose. This is a big question, but I'm just wondering if maybe you can shed some light for us on your experience engaging with the government and policymakers on this issue, and some challenges that you may have had, or any insights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking that question. For us in the environmental justice movement, we think that the best policies are actually the ones that have community engagement to actually follow through on implementation and continue to refine those policies as we see them hit the ground and make the adjustments as needed. And so policies that are passed or laws that are passed that the community or the public don't really know much about becomes a dangerous thing, because there are certain people that are making decisions about that about a whole swath of the community that may be a bad move. But the public or the community have to suffer the consequences of that. And so in California, and my experience with environmental justice communities is that even when I worked on, an example in Oakland and our Energy and Climate Action Plan out of Oakland, it's one of the strongest and robust and exciting energy and climate action programs, or ECAPs, in the country. And we had a coalition of maybe 40 or 50 groups, and it wasn't even actually the mainstream environmental groups that were part of the ECAP program or designing that. It was a lot of environmental justice groups, affordable housing, transit, urban gardeners, who were interested in different ways to approach climate and the different groups that look at climate programs and how to develop emissions reductions from what they're familiar with. And so I think a lot of communities are actually, they may not speak climate or speak environment, but they love their community and have a lot to contribute about the wisdom that they have about that community and what their vision is for improving, making changes and improvements in the community. And so we should make policies that either come from the ground, from ideas that come from the communities, or that policies, especially in your academic settings, these brilliant ideas that you may have, you still have to test it out to see if it's going to work on the ground. And there are lots of community groups that you can go to that are not necessarily your environmental or climate groups, but community-based groups and cultural groups, and have those conversations with them early on. Because I will tell you, if you just kind of say, well, this is what you need to do, and this is my best idea, and you just have to do it, and it's going to have harmful effects, you're going to have protests and resistance. And it's better to engage them on the front end.
One more question.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Katie Murray, and I'm a candidate for the Master of Environmental Management here at Yale. And my question is about carbon taxes, whether it's being discussed as an alternative to the cap and trade program, or in combination with it, and what your opinions are of that.
I can start. So the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee is actually we're in the process of creating our 2030 climate plan, or called the scoping plan, to meet those targets for 2030 emissions reductions. And so our 13-member Environmental Justice Advisory Committee are looking at the various aspects. There's like 9 different sectors that we're developing our expertise in, or giving our guidance in. And one of them is around industry. Do we have to continue cap and trade, or are there other ways to reduce emissions from these big industries? And we want the state to actually study a carbon tax or a carbon fee or a cap and dividend as a mechanism. And actually, the first EJAC back in 2008 or 2009 wanted that study from the Air Resources Board before picking cap and trade. We wanted to see what the other mechanisms were, and can we get stronger emissions reductions? Can we get better economic benefits for California through these other mechanisms? And they didn't do it. It was cap and trade was fast-tracked, and they didn't do the proper study on these other mechanisms. And I think from the environmental justice community, we much rather prefer a carbon tax and chuck cap and trade.
Jump in. I think it's always going to be discussed. I think Mary Rose hit it correctly. There's still an outstanding question on the current system as we begin to discuss it, but I always think it's wise to have and understand what the alternatives are. So hopefully that recommendation by the committee will be accepted by the board. I think it's always good to have alternatives.
It's a very interesting question. Industry has different opinions on that in particular. There are some who think it's simpler and cleaner. They're, not in the environmental sense, but just in the, economic sense. There are others who think that there's advantages to the cap and trade system in that, it allows for more flexibility, and that obviously, I think environmental justice issues, start to creep in there as well, and into that discussion. But it's take a step back, politically in California, the T word, and not Texas as we talked about at lunch, but tax is, a very unlikely scenario in the state of California, absent going to the ballot potentially. And even then, there's still a lot of interests that are aligned against it that would have a very significant campaign. But in California, we require a 2/3 vote to increase fees and taxes now. And politically, that's just not feasible that we would get to that particular scenario. There is outstanding litigation around the cap and trade program that was brought by a couple of companies in the California Chamber of Commerce. That's still outstanding at the appellate court level. So, we've yet to see whether or not the outcome on that is going to influence what happens with the auction component of the cap and trade program. And not to get too deep into the details given our short time, but there's the cap and trade program, which says here's your emission levels. So go below that. If you can get below that, you can trade. Or if you're above that, you can buy. So there's opportunity in the cap and trade. The auction is a portion that ARB held back, what they call the haircut, that they then sell in auctions that are held quarterly throughout these up until 2020. So the revenue from that then funds greenhouse gas reduction fund programs, which Mary Rose mentioned a number of those that have already been allocated some money from that program. But the carbon tax, is going to be an interesting ongoing discussion. The lawsuit that I mentioned a moment ago actually claims that the cap and trade auction component is a tax, or it behaves like a tax at least. So wait until the court decides, an outcome there to determine whether or not that is the view of the courts on that particular issue, and then that will then influence, where discussions go from there. In the meantime, there is active discussions going on around extending the cap and trade program specifically. That we would think also for legal protection would require a 2/3 vote, just to ensure that whatever that outcome of the lawsuit is, does not negatively affect, what we're trying to do on the cap and trade program now.
So as you can see from this panel discussion that we had here today, there's a lot of complexities in terms of how do you legislate, how do you deal with issues of environmental justice and diversity in the policymaking process. Here, we have issues of cost effectiveness, issues of the scientific language about how do we address reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and then also issues about equity. Is it, again, about California or the world? So here are important questions that are often messy and will continue to be messy unless individuals work together and find common solutions. And we've seen it happen before in California and throughout the world. And there's opportunities to find different types of policy alternatives, some that include offsets, some that may not, or that may include different combinations. But again, here at F&ES, I think this is what we really are interested in looking at as the next environmental leaders. How do we integrate issues of justice, equity, and sustainability all at once? So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the first lecture series on diverse voices, and we hope to see you again in the next coming weeks. Thank you. Let's give